You, especially you. You've been talking smack about my camera, and I'm here today to put that all to rest. If you're thinking about a Burano camera or any other Sony camera from the FX3 on up through the Venice, please reach out to us here at Z Systems. You can find our contact information down below, or you can find us online at zsyst.com. Hello everyone, Keith with Z Systems here. I'm rental manager and camera specialist here at Z Systems. Today I wanted to make a video to address some of the myths, misconceptions, rumors, and things that are just downright not true or misleading out there on the internet, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Reddit, wherever it is about the Sony Burano camera. One thing a lot of people online are talking about with the Sony Burano camera is that the viewfinder mount is awkward. And they're right, it is. Sony did something a little different with the Burano viewfinder, and it's not as convenient as maybe they wanted it to be. But the good news is there's a bunch of third-party manufacturers out there that either have put out or are working on development of affordable options for swapping out the stock viewfinder mount with something that's more convenient. Mid49 has one, Small Rig has one, Shape, Zacuto, Wooden Camera, they're all doing something about the awkward viewfinder, and for the most part those solutions are $50 or less. So yes, the viewfinder mount is a bit awkward, but the good news is the solutions are out there and they're affordable. One other thing that's come up a number of times is regarding XOCN and the fact that XOCN isn't available to users in custom mode. Custom mode is, it's made for broadcast. It's designed to take the latitude of the sensor, because the sensor can detect those many stops of dynamic range, and it adjusts them in a way that is safe for transmission over the air or via cable and can be displayed on the most TVs. Similarly, people have talked about the limited dynamic range in custom mode, and again, that is just a fact of shooting in custom mode. Custom mode is designed for broadcast. It is 7 stops of dynamic range. That's all it will ever be. The good news is the Burano has both custom mode for those fast turnarounds, or if your client just does not want to deal with log footage, and it has log recording and raw recording. So in custom mode, Rec 709, you get 7 stops of dynamic range. With Cine EI mode or XOCN recording, you get, depending on who asks and who's doing the testing, between 12 and 16 stops of dynamic range when you're recording raw or log. If you ask Sony, it's 16 stops by the way that they measure it. A more standard way of measuring it that uses the photometrics, it is around 12 or 12 and a half stops, which is right in line with Venice and the older Alexas and the Canons, and 12 is right about where most cinema cameras fall in terms of measured dynamic range. Riffing a little bit further on custom mode and S-Cinetone in particular, people have been posting that S-Cinetone doesn't handle highlights very well in custom mode, and it's not designed to. And custom mode, S-Cinetone, Rec 709, it's all the same thing, and it is a broadcast way of recording. And it's actually rolling off the highlights. Every camera does it in their custom mode or Rec 709 mode, whatever they happen to call it, basically because codec that you're using, the gamma curve that you're using, can't do anything with that data, so it just kind of rolls it off and calls it good, because for broadcast you can't represent that information, and so there's nothing that you can do with it. And so it's a choice that they all make when they're doing custom or Rec 709 recording. Another real oddball issue that's popped up from time to time is like a pulsing or flickering issue when using the ND filter in the Burano in certain lenses. The first one that I know of that occurred, it was actually a factory defect with that particular camera. Sony reached out to the person involved, replaced the camera, got it fixed, and that issue went away. There are, however, a couple of things to be aware of when using the variable ND and electronically controlled lenses like the Sony E-mounts or Sigmas or anything like that. Those two things are making sure that your electrical contacts are clean. If the camera and the lens aren't communicating well because of some fault in the electrical contacts, that can cause the lens to freak out a little bit and open and close the aperture kind of erratically. The good news is, just get a little bit of electrical cleaning solution, rub off those contacts, and that problem should be solved. The other thing that can occur is if the camera is set to do lens compensation and it doesn't know what lens is on the camera, it can kind of just pulse a little bit trying to find where it should be in terms of the lens compensation. That can happen with adapted lenses where there's no communication being passed from lens to camera, or with just older lenses that might not be sending the communication the way that the camera expects it. So it's easy to go in and turn off the lens compensations in the camera, and that that artifact should disappear. Another thing that's popped up as people have taken this camera out into the field and started really using it, some people have seen some issues with IR or infrared pollution on the sensor while using the ND filters. Yes, you can see IR pollution on the Burano camera, but it is not actually any worse than you'd see on any of Sony's other cameras with a variable ND. So FS7, FX9, FX6, they all have the same ND filter. What people are seeing is they end up pushing the camera to the absolute limits of what it can do. They're outside in direct sunlight. The ND filter is set to maximum, and the lens aperture is wide open, and they get IR pollution. And that's going to happen pretty much anytime you do something with a variable ND filter, and in those conditions, because you're at maximum. You've got 7 stops of ND filtration, so you're letting through 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128th of the light. So 1/128th of the amount of light that is coming through the lens is actually making it to the sensor, which is a pretty drastic reduction in the amount of light. And with ND filters, there's some, play with, where does it actually cut off between the visible spectrum of red and the infrared spectrum. And, if you go too aggressive with the infrared, you actually start losing red in visible light. And vice versa. If you're not aggressive enough with the ND filter, you end up picking up more infrared pollution. It's a calculation that Sony made as to where to put that cutoff. If you do have issues with infrared pollution in situations like that, where you just don't have other options, stopping down the lens, putting up a silk to screen the light, the solution there is to get just a super dense threaded on ND filter for the end of the lens. There's nothing wrong with the way that the Burano's doing it. It's not abnormal versus anything else that Sony's done with their cameras. It's just, people have pushed it to the point. And I think, one of the other things, it's a new camera, it's an expensive camera. There's been a lot of hype about it before it came out. And so people were looking at the camera possibly more critically than they look at other cameras when they do these comparisons. And so I think some of that might have filtered through as to, like confirmation bias, essentially. Like they're looking for problems, and so they pushed it to the max, and they found an issue. But if they did it with any other camera, they'd find the same issue. Elephant in the room, the rolling shutter. Possibly the most marked criticism of the Burano camera since its release is the rolling shutter when you're using the full frame. I think CVP measured it at a little over 17 milliseconds. Cine measured it at 18-something milliseconds. Is not the fastest out there, but it's also pretty average for an 8K sensor. When you compare it to the A1 or the A7R5 or the Canon R5C, the rolling shutter number is kind of in the middle of all of those. It's only when you compare the rolling shutter of the Burano to, like the FX3, the FX6, or Venice that, it is markedly slow by comparison. It is faster than the FX9. It's faster than a bunch of other cameras. And if you compare it, pixel-wise, quantity of pixels that the Burano is reading versus the FX3 and the FX6, it's reading 4.5 times more pixels, and it's doing it in roughly twice the amount of time. So it is actually reading faster than those other cameras. It's just got more to read. And realistically, the amount of rolling shutter that the Burano has is, like I said, average for an 8K camera, and pretty average for cameras all across the board. It's average. It's just average. Get over it. Don't do whip pans. Why are you doing whip pans? Stop doing whip pans. Sony is addressing the rolling shutter issue in a kind of way with the next firmware update. They are adding a scan mode that uses the full sensor but doesn't read the full resolution, which will make the camera scan that full sensor faster in terms of how it's recording. How much that's going to affect our rolling shutter and whether or not there are other possible concerns like moire, aliasing, pixel binning, things like that, we'll have to see. But they are addressing the rolling shutter in pretty much the only way that they can. The only other way to do it is to replace the processor in the camera, and they're just not going to do it. It would be too expensive, and you'd have to send your cameras in. And so, they're giving you some scan modes in the future that should help with that if it is a concern. The full takeaway is it's pretty average rolling shutter. There's some solutions coming down the road that might help with it a little bit. Stop doing whip pans. So no in-body image stabilization on Desqueeze, which if you think about it makes sense, because the image isn't being mapped to the sensor the way you'd expect it to be, and so the motion's going to be inconsistent across the imager. With anamorphic, the lens is seeing a wide image and it's squeezing it laterally to fit on the sensor. And so, the sensor, if it's behind that moving, the motion is not, it's not going to be consistent, because, the further out you go from the center of the sensor, the further it's moving relative to what it should. And so there's just no way for the camera to accurately compensate for that, because you're squeezing an image, but the camera doesn't know what to do with that and how to math it. And I'm not sure you could, because you'd need more movement or less movement relative to another portion of the sensor than is possible. It doesn't work. There's also been a lot of talk about different aspects of the output of the Burano camera, whether it's the SDI, the HDMI, overlays, desqueezes, what is and isn't available, based off of a smorgasbord of camera settings. I'm not going to talk about those individually or really in detail right now, because with Sony's announced firmware, firmware 2.0, they have announced that they will be standardizing outputs across all of the camera settings. So with that update, we should be able to get our overlays on SDI no matter what our recording codec is, desqueeze no matter what resolution we're using, things like that. So it is a known pain point with the Burano camera, is that the outputs are a little bit funky, a little bit finicky, just kind of different things are available at different times. So hopefully with that firmware update, we should see all of that addressed and unified, which will be a big help to pretty much everybody. Because if you're using on-set monitors or even on-camera monitors, you want to be able to output certain things, and right now, sometimes you just can't. But it is an issue that is being addressed by Sony. All right, hopefully we've covered most of the myths, misconceptions, and other issues that you've heard about with the Sony Burano camera. If there's any that we missed that you'd like to hear us talk about, leave it in a comment below, and we will try to address it in a future video.